Hello, I'm George Shackelford. I'm Deputy Director of the Kimball Art Museum, and it's my great pleasure to speak to you today about J.M.W. Turner, known during his lifetime as William Turner, one of the most accomplished painters in the history of art, and certainly Britain's greatest artist. We have on view at the Kimball Art Museum now Turner's Modern World, an exhibition organized by the Tate Britain in London and shared with us by them and with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where the exhibition will be in 2022. Today, I'm going to speak to you about Turner in the modern world. Who, in fact, is Turner? Here he is in a self-portrait from the very end of the 18th century. He was reclusive, curmudgeonly, a bit of a misanthrope. He was born in London in the 1770s, died there in the 1850s. He never lost his Cockney accent, though he consorted with dukes and earls and kings. And we know a lot about him, a lot of facts, but we still are putting together who Turner really was. He hated to have his portrait made, and there are therefore relatively few portraits of him. And to my mind, they're not very dependable. Here are two drawings, presumably made from life, that don't, to me, look like the same person, though we know that they are both from Turner. Or these. Perhaps the one on the right was made from memory rather than from life. These are certainly both constructed from memory. Turner at the British Museum and Turner in his studio with palette and maulstick and his canvas on the easel before him. There's the legendary Turner who went to the Royal Academy with bottles of paint and oils and varnish. And on varnishing day, when you were supposed only to adjust the varnish on your picture, Turner would be there actually completing his paintings and adding elements to the pictures in the course of making them. Here he is in two rather cartoonish images. The one on the right is by his young follower, John Everett Millais, who was, like Turner, very much admired by the critic John Ruskin. There's Turner standing on a box in the background so that he can reach his painting hanging on the wall of the Royal Academy. And here we have the screen recreation for Mr. Turner by Mike Leigh, of Turner on varnishing day in the film. We think the image on the right may be a photograph of Turner taken by the London photographer Mayall, and there's no proof for this, but we think it might actually be a daguerreotype of Turner. So we have then Turner young and Turner old, and between these two poles, we have a lifetime of activity in a modern context. When Turner was born, George III was King of Britain. When Turner was a child, the American Revolution was being fought. And in fact, Britain would be at war for much of Turner's young lifetime. By the time Turner paints the field of Waterloo in 1817, his ambitions for painting war have come to a close. And in this monumental canvas in the exhibition here in Fort Worth, you see him ruminating on the horrible effects of war and the tragedy of war for all people concerned. Turner lived into the age of great industry, and he was born at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and lived to see the invention of steam engines and trains, steamboats. He saw the abolition of British slavery. Here, his slave ship from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, depicting slaves being thrown overboard so that they could be counted as lost cargo in a storm. And he lived to see the Crystal Palace being built during the reign of Queen Victoria, shown here with her second son, the Duke of Wellington, offering a jeweled basket to the child, and Prince Albert gazing over his shoulder at the Crystal Palace exhibition, which he was so much a part of. And here in 1851, then, the Crystal Palace, the year of Turner's death. You couldn't get more modern in the 19th century than something like this. A great industrial building made of cast iron and glass, a technical marvel. And it was the last great building that happened during Turner's lifetime. But I want to step back here and go to the beginning of Turner's career and to what constituted modernity when he was a young man. And here I call this part of my talk the Modern Sublime. Here's Turner in the 1790s in a foundry outside a lime kiln where limestone is being burned to generate lime, in another foundry, and still another with his tiny sketchbooks that he carried around in his pockets when he was on his travels throughout Britain. And here again, another lime kiln by moonlight at this time. Now, these paintings, which seem to concentrate on men being productive in a quasi-industrial setting, are pretty much at odds with the kind of paintings which Turner really produced in great numbers at this period, like this gorgeous, very large exhibition watercolor of a fantasy landscape with Windsor Castle in the middle ground. This kind of painting was in the tradition of British watercolor landscape painting by artists like Paul Sandby, whose work is shown at left. Here's another great Sandby showing his sitters, the aristocratic women in the lower right, actually out in the landscape with their paint box, making paintings of a picturesque view. You see a country woman and her daughter crossing a beautiful wooden bridge with a stone bridge and a castle in the deeper background. Every element contrived and selected very carefully by the artist. It's not that Turner never painted pictures like this or didn't continue to paint pictures like this later in his lifetime. Here's, for instance, a beautiful watercolor in the exhibition of a lock on a canal. But Turner was affected early in his career by the ideas of 18th century aesthetics, which gave value to the emotions that were inspired by either miraculous works of nature or of man. And here we have Joseph Wright of Derby painting a crowd gathered around an astronomical instrument, being fascinated by science and, of course, by the remarkable light that's being cast by the pseudo-sun at the center of the instrument. Take Wright of Derby indoors, and we find him exploring the qualities of light and the dramatic possibilities of light in a painting like his Iron Forge of 1772. Now, the whole notion of a forge as a subject is a wonderful late 18th century invention. And here is a painting, for instance, by a Swedish artist painted in 1782, which shows the interior of a forge and juxtaposes the workers, very hard at work at the left, with visitors, aristocratic visitors to the iron forge at the right. Turner himself is a visitor to the iron forge, not so aristocratic, an artist, an observer, almost a voyeur perhaps, because he surely was not much regarded by the people who were going about their work, just as Wright of Derby in his studio was not regarded by the people who he had observed in the iron forge. Turner, we think, is actually making his work of art, at least in some part, on the spot. The spot would change over Turner's lifetime, and here, for instance, about 25 years later is what an iron foundry would look like, a large industrial ironworks with all the building itself made of iron, the kind of iron that was being created in the ironworks here in Wales. Now, all of this, the inspiration for all of these could be a subject as commonplace in mythology as the forge of Vulcan. Vulcan, the god of fire and of the making of armor, for instance, who was often entreated by goddesses like Venus to arm a protected mortal under her care, for instance. And this late 17th century image of the forge of Vulcan shows you how the type of painting that Turner was making would have been construed perhaps by the most erudite onlooker. And where there is Vulcan, there has got to be fire. And where there is the making of iron, there has to be heat and fire. And here is Jacques-Philippe de Loutherbourg's earlier view of the Colebrookdale Ironworks, a very important center for iron making in Shropshire, where the sense of the burning of the coal and the heating of the iron ore is made so paramount and so, in fact, so sublime that characteristic of awe-inspiring beauty or terror. Now, where Vulcan is, there might also be a volcano. And in fact, Turner's view of the lime kiln in the moonlight must have been inspired by a picture like Joseph Wright of Derby's volcano erupting. This is Mount Vesuvius erupting in Naples. And indeed, Wright of Derby painted many pictures of Vesuvius in eruption, again, intensifying the emotional content headed towards that sensation of the sublime that Turner was after as well, when Turner himself made a watercolor of the eruption of Vesuvius, which he had not seen before he made this watercolor. He never saw a volcanic eruption, and in fact, his watercolor is completely fictional, based on the observation of works of art by other artists, scientific or artistic. But that fascination with fire and light is something that carries on into his career, into the 1840s, and throughout the 1830s, 40s, and into the 50s. Turner is fascinated by fiery light. Here we have, again, the slave ship from Boston. Here we have a painting in the exhibition, The Burning of the Houses of Parliament, from the Cleveland Museum of Art from the mid-1830s, in which the consumption of the Houses of Parliament, the old medieval Houses of Parliament, by fire was a spectacular, sublime incident in the lives of many Londoners, thousands of Londoners who gathered on the banks of the Thames to watch the building be engulfed in flames. And then finally, a work like this from the Royal Academy exhibition of 1846, The Angel in the Sun, which is a mysterious, hard to interpret work in which an angel is standing above figures drawn from the Old Testament, in which violence, shame, or sorrow are being represented. Turner perhaps looked upon this as a kind of pessimistic prediction for the rest of his life. For after about 1846, he was to withdraw from the world and live alone and basically not be participating in the world of art, and indeed becoming something of a recluse and a hermit until his death in 1851. For all that Turner ended his life as a hermit, a recluse, withdrawn from the world, he was not always that way. And in fact, there is a remarkable body of work by Turner which shows a kind of social side of him. Take, for example, this large painting that he painted called England on the Prince Regent's birthday, a view from Richmond Hill near his home, which is filled with social activity. It was painted in the hope that the Prince Regent would actually acquire it. And it shows the beautiful men and women of England in the most beautiful of English landscape settings, this hill, a view which is still preserved by an act of Parliament today. And the Prince Regent, certainly the most fashionable man in England, the most powerful young man in England, an art collector, a connoisseur, an architect of fantastic buildings, and very much a bon vivant. And here we have two paintings of the Prince Regent by Thomas Lawrence to give a sensation of the flair with which the Prince Regent lived and behaved. As I said, Turner hoped that the Prince Regent would buy his painting, but that came to naught. Still, it's, I think, one of the most wonderful pictures in our exhibition, and one which deserves some study and some interpretation, I think. Here we have the central figure from the central group of figures from the foreground of the painting, a group which is very much inspired by the works of Jean-Antoine Watteau. Enchanted Isle, I show you at the right here. This is a painting that Turner copied, and you see his sort of doodle after the painting in a notebook at the left, probably when the painting belonged to Sir Joshua Reynolds, or perhaps at a slightly later date. It was also a painting that was engraved so that he could have seen a picture after it. And it's this kind of painting that inspired him when he turned to paint the group of figures in the foreground of England on the Prince Regent's birthday. Now, that he was interested in Watteau, we can attest by this painting, which he exhibited some years later, which is a kind of fantasy of the studio of Watteau, a hodgepodge of images drawn from his work, an easel in the background holding paintings, a palette and brushes in the foreground, a mandolin, a book, figures in elegant costume, and a fantasy of what life might have been like in Watteau's studio, including this painting from the collection of the Dulwich Picture Gallery in Dulwich on the south bank of the Thames, where the museum had opened only the year before the painting of Turner's monumental England on the Prince Regent's birthday. Oddly enough, Turner's painting reverses the composition of this Watteau. He must have painted his own picture from an engraving which reversed the composition. One of the details in England on the Prince Regent's birthday that I like the most is the cricket game that's going on in the middle distance. And here it's a very tiny detail, which you can perceive that the entirely stable crackle pattern of the aging paint in the picture, much magnified here by my photograph. Reading through the crackle pattern, you can see the young men in their shirt sleeves playing a game of cricket on a distant pasture, a lawn down below the main figures. Here they are, and you can see the interest in little details of fashion and conversation that Turner gets into. Here, for instance, in between the two groups of figures, he includes two dogs that are playing with each other. Men and women gathered together, the woman in blue at the center who looks directly at us and seems to be almost walking towards us, a picture of fashionableness in Turner's Regency, England. It harkens back to this painting by Thomas Gainsborough from the 18th century, in which we see men and women socializing with each other in a public setting, elegantly attired and behaving in a social way, much as they do in Turner's England on the Prince Regent's birthday. Now here, back to this monumental painting, and to another fact about it, which is that the landscape that it represents is a real place, and a place that Turner knew well. It's also about a real person. And here we have George IV, after his accession to the throne, whom Turner followed to Edinburgh and painted in a group of pictures made there or slightly after his return to London from memory or sketches, in which a visit of the monarch, the first in 100 years, more than 100 years, took place, the British monarch going to Edinburgh to visit his court in Scotland. And here we see a magnificent banquet given in his honor there. And here either his arrival or his departure. He went by sea, of course, from London up to Edinburgh. The painting, again, had a personal significance, not only historical, but personal, because it was at Twickenham, nearby Richmond, that Turner built himself a house in which he lived, in addition to having a house in London, and a place where he was able to receive guests and have a sort of a social life. Among the people that he met there was Louis-Philippe of Orléans, who was to become King Louis-Philippe, but who was, during this period, in the first decades, in the Napoleonic time, during the Empire, in the first decades of the 19th century, he was in exile, a banished royal who was living first in the United States, in Canada, in the Caribbean, and finally settling in Twickenham, near London, where he lived until he returned to France at the time of the overthrow of Napoleon and the restoration of the monarchy. As I said, he would go on to become king. Not all of Turner's patrons were merchants and tradesmen or captains of industry. Sometimes they were aristocrats. And this painting was painted of the Chichester Canal, was painted for Lord Egremont, an extremely powerful man in England, who also was extraordinarily rich and who had a magnificent collection of art. And Turner painted a group of these horizontal pictures for his house in the country called Petworth, the grand mansion that you see in the background here in one of Turner's horizontal pictures made for Petworth, and the house itself as it looks today. Lord Egremont, shown here in black with the yellow pants, received crowned heads of Europe. Here is a conference being held at his house by the heads of state of the governments that were opposing Napoleon. And so it was a place of great pomp and circumstance, and a place where Turner was received frequently as a guest and as a friend to the house. Here's what one of the rooms at Petworth looks like today, and here's what it looked like, or what a similar room looked like in Turner's time. Turner does a remarkable set of watercolors and paintings of Petworth, which are not in this exhibition, but I wanted to show them to you because they give us a sense of Turner's sociability. Here he is painting again and again these gorgeous interiors in this house, peopled by old master paintings, portraits in large part, but with a picture gallery with large-scale sculpture, a real sort of museum within the house, which Turner would very much admire. And it was also a place where he could make art and where he could talk to the people of the house about the creation of works of art. Here he is, for instance, in the room that was set aside as his studio with the ladies of the house, a scene which, again, was recreated for Mike Lee's Mr. Turner. In fact, it's these ladies that I find so fascinating, going back to the beauties in the foreground of England, Richmond Hill on the Prince Regent's birthday. The elegant beauties that we see in that painting are echoed in the pictures that he makes at Petworth, these very quickly done watercolors that show the social side of his stay at this wonderful country house. And they remind me of the kinds of paintings that were made by an artist like Eugène Lamy, who was one of the most active painters in France at this time, essentially coeval with Turner, and who was very much associated with the court of Louis Philippe. In fact, when Queen Victoria went to visit Louis Philippe at his chateau, the Chateau d'Eu, in Normandy, she was depicted by Lamy not only in an oil painting. Here is the arrival of her carriage in front of the house, but in a series of watercolors that Louis Philippe commissioned to give to Queen Victoria at a later date in memory of her visit to him, a visit that had important diplomatic consequences because it was the first time that a British monarch and a French monarch had met since the great Napoleonic Wars and since the conclusion of the wars between England and France in 1815. Victoria and her family were shown with Louis Philippe and his family in this painting by Winterhalter. And here in another watercolor by Winterhalter, we see Louis Philippe bidding goodbye to Queen Victoria aboard her yacht. Now, Louis Philippe returned the favor and came to see Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the following year and arrived at Portsmouth. Here is a painting of what the arrival of his ship looked like. I'm particularly amazed by the lines of sailors who are on the masts in the middle distance where you see the rising of the masts of the ship. And Turner went down to Portsmouth to paint this event. Nothing could be further from the precision of that previous view of the arrival of Louis Philippe than Turner's abstract pictures of this event. Certainly, these paintings are unfinished, but it's hard to imagine that they could ever have attained, or that he ever would have wanted to attain, the kind of detail and interest in the specificity of the visit in the way that artists like Winterhalter or Lamy were interested. Here we have the arrival of Louis Philippe. It's hard to tell where the boat is, where the king might be. And here his disembarkation. It's as if we see the crowd greeting him, but he simply isn't there. And again, the paintings are unfinished, so it's hard for us to know what might have been in Turner's mind as he was building up the composition. But certainly what we see here is a painting of extraordinary energy, and again, from the mid-1840s, recalling that visit. Now, Louis Philippe and Turner had met, as I said, in Twickenham in the first years of the 19th century. And so Turner himself was invited by Louis Philippe to visit him at the Chateau d'Eu, just like Victoria and Albert had done. And in a sketchbook, he drew the roofline of the chateau in the drawing at the right. He might have been entertained there at a gathering like this concert in one of the grand halls of the chateau. And it's thought that this watercolor might well reference the interior of the chateau with its arch windows and doorways, and that this table, a banquet table, which is a watercolor in a sketchbook in this exhibition, might in fact reflect the experience of dining with King Louis Philippe at his magnificent French chateau. And finally, a keepsake given by Louis Philippe to Turner, a gold snuff box encrusted with diamonds with Louis Philippe's initials and his crown on the top, now in the British Museum. Perhaps the most remarkable occurrence, effectively, during Turner's lifetime was the radical transformation of industry and power in Britain. At the beginning of Turner's career, animals were the source of labor and power. Here, donkeys are at rest beside a mine shaft, and they would be tethered to a a kind of turning wheel to provide the power that would lift ore out of the ground. Donkeys were replaced over the course of Turner's lifetime by the invention of the steam engine and the so-called Watt engine, which very soon became portable. Here's a drawing for a portable steam engine. And you can see that it's a very, very short step from a portable steam engine with wheels to a railroad engine. And here we have an engraving of an early railroad train, the Planet, it was called, that was the kind of the machine that transformed life in Great Britain. The advent of the railway train, and as I'll show you in a moment, the steam engine on a steamboat made everything different. It made traveling through Great Britain and the moving of goods infinitely more easy. And it, of course, made foreign travel much more easy as well. Here's an early train in a photograph from the period. And here's what train travel looked like in between Liverpool and Manchester. And you see the varying degrees of comfort, from the elegant cars in the top rank to the open cars in the center, to goods being carried on the train, and finally livestock on the bottom row. And in Turner's extraordinarily famous picture, Rain, Steam, and Speed, unfortunately not in this exhibition, though very much germane to it, and it was in the London venue of the exhibition. Rain, Steam, and Speed is, of course, Turner's hymn or statement on the subject of man and power and the Industrial Revolution. We see a train barreling towards us. You recognize the shape of it, that train engine. On the track just in front of the train, hard to see here, but believe me, there is a small rabbit running away from the train. And in the background, the carriage bridge across the Thames, which is a sort of reference to slow travel by horse-drawn carriage, when you could choose, in fact, to go on the speedy train, the train that was, again, as I said, transforming the whole nature of movement of people. And as some people would say, it changes time as well, and one's perception of time, when to get from one place to another becomes a much shorter interval. Here then, the animal-like engine, and we see people, in fact, who are in open carriages in this train. Here's an image of a collier, a man who makes his living mining coal, and we see in the middle ground a goods train that's actually going to take the lumps of coal to another location, and in the far background, the coal mine with its steam-powered engine bringing the coal up from the ground. And coal was, of course, the source of power for Britain in the first half of the 19th century. It was the fuel that made steam engines run. It was burned in homes. It was a commodity that was very richly available in England and in Wales. And the mining of coal was, of course, an extraordinarily important industry in Great Britain. Before the advent of the steam engine, and here we have a scene taken at night of colliers who are loading coal onto ships to take it from Newcastle on the Tyne. Shields, in fact, is the town on the River Tyne, where these boats are going to take off from, to go around the bottom of Britain and to up the river into London, to carry this coal from the Midlands to its place of consumption in the big cities. And this beautiful watercolor in the exhibition shows you the industry that was going forward at night by torchlight, with these men taking coal out of some kind of wagon or some sort of transport and putting it into a ship, into the hull of a ship for transport. from one place to another. But soon, all of this would be taken up by the steamship. And the invention of the steamship, which there were some in the very late 18th century, but by the 1820s, there were steamboats very much in use and in action in Great Britain and around and to and fro to the continent. Here is a drawing of an early steamship. And these were used both for industrial purposes and for pleasure purposes, or for the moving of people as well as of goods. And here you see a print showing a steamship in juxtaposition with the sailing ships of various sizes, and the steamship plowing its way through the waters very directly, not depending on the wind, and itself a marvel of modern travel. It's a marvel that Turner would paint repeatedly. Here, for instance, on the Seine River near Rouen in France. And steam power became the dominant way of getting to and from places across the sea. Here we see a satirical cartoon called The Steamboat, in which a woman says how wonderful it is to travel, and the man says, if it only didn't shake so much. That must have been the experience of riding on a steamboat in Turner's time. And here we have a great painting in the exhibition from the Yale Center for British Art, Staffa Fingal's Cave, which shows a steamboat off the coast of Scotland in between storm and sunlight, a highly romantic picture with a fierce sea in the foreground, black and white birds flying over the sea, and the sun setting in the background. But the steamboat becoming the stand-in for the presence of mankind in the great and powerful natural world. Of course, it's mankind who will lose in this battle, as is proven again and again, and in paintings like this one of the steamship caught in a snowstorm off a harbor's mouth. A remarkable picture, also in the exhibition, one of Turner's greatest images of mechanical power in the face of nature. This has come to be one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition. It's the Thames above Waterloo Bridge. And what we see in the center of the painting are the arches of Waterloo Bridge, a bridge that has a modern replacement, still very much in use. And at the left, we see two smokestacks of a steamboat belching out their fumes into the air. And at the right, you see a tower, the shot tower, that was attached to a factory that made gunshot, the tiny iron pellets for shotguns. And it is emblematic of all of the industry that was located on the south bank of the Thames, opposite the main part of the city of London. In fact, London was growing and changing radically during Turner's lifetime. And in this watercolor in the exhibition from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we see Turner imagining himself standing above the Royal Hospital at Greenwich, which you see the twin domes in the lower right-hand corner, and gazing upriver towards London to see the Dome of St. Paul's at almost the very center of the canvas, and all of the ships crowding round, steamships as well as sailing ships, crowding into the Thames to get into London. In the lower left-hand corner, we see people who are marveling at the difference between London in 1526 and in 1825, a huge transformation that would become even faster in the succeeding decades. In fact, London had grown by 1850, when this map was drawn, into one of the biggest cities in the world. And yet it was that central part of London along the Thames that was Turner's central focus of interest in paintings like the Thames above Waterloo. Now, it's fascinating This is a painting that, to our eyes in 2021, is fundamentally about pollution. And of course, in our imagination, of course, about climate change. But I think that was a concept that was not really of great interest to Turner as he was painting this, for all that the painting records a circumstance that was highly important to the lives of 19th century Victorian Londoners. The rise of industry and the change in the air of cities. Here is an industrial city, perhaps Birmingham. We are not exactly sure what, it might be Dudley, a watercolor that's so filled with smoke that we can't see the forms of the buildings. Or this watercolor, not in the exhibition, but a beautiful example of an industrial environment, very much changed by the exhaust from perhaps an iron foundry at the right, and other kinds of factories at the left. And London was absolutely being transformed by this, and it was becoming one of the dirtiest cities in the world, as well as one of the largest. A city which could be depicted in this rather gruesome wood engraving by Gustave Doré from a couple of decades later, a circumstance that was still very much prevalent at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, with these soot-covered buildings surrounding factories on the south bank of the Thames. And the importance of all of this factory activity for the life of the capital could hardly be overestimated. Here we have the very edge of Waterloo Bridge at the left, the shot tower that I showed you a moment ago, and another Fowler's Ironworks, et cetera, et cetera. This teeming life of industry on the south bank of the river. The river and its pollution had become a source of some humor to British cartoonists. Here's one called Monster Soup, commonly called Thames Water, being a correct representation of that precious stuff doled out to us, and a fanciful illustration of what Thames water would look like under the magnifying glass. And again, in the 19th century, the Thames was regarded as an absolute pestilence. And here, Father Thames offering up his children diphtheria, scrofula, and cholera to the emblem of Britannia. But this pollution was very much the symbol of progress. And here we see London in 1851 in a lithograph by a French artist. And we get the sense of the activity that was going on along the banks of the Thames at the time of the creation of the Crystal Palace. Here we see from over the Crystal Palace, looking back to that same stretch of river, and the magnificent building of the palace, which was the emblem of industry and progress at that time. Its halls filled with the produce of nations and of the great machines that would constitute one of Britain's greatest contributions to the modernization of the world in the middle years of the 19th century, in the years just after Turner's view of the Thames above Waterloo. So the modern machine, a source of interest to Turner in this period. I'd like to turn in the last part of my talk to what I've called here post-mortem, to Turner in the modern world, but after his death. The presence of Turner in the modern world rather than the modern world in the work of Turner. Here, the young Turner, the photograph that may be the old Turner, and comparing it to his death mask, taken, a plaster cast taken from his face after his death, I could see that, in fact, the photograph could well be the aged Turner. And when Turner died, he left his collection to the nation. He had early on bequeathed a group of his paintings to the National Gallery with the proviso that they hang next to the works of Claude Lorrain. Here is Turner's painting of Dido building Carthage, and he wanted it to hang at the National Gallery, his nation's gallery, beside the work of the 17th century artist that he admired so much, Claude Lorrain. Here, a painting that often hangs beside Dido creating Carthage at the left. But the number of paintings that there were in the Turner bequest was overwhelming. There were 300 oil paintings and some 30,000 works on paper. They simply could not be all housed at the premises of the National Gallery. For a time, some of them were put into Marlborough House, which was a building on Pall Mall, where they could be exhibited with the rest of the National Gallery's British pictures. But when that house was occupied by the Prince of Wales, they were kicked out and sent to South Kensington, to the South Kensington Museum, here shown in an aerial view, which is on the spot where we now have the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And in the distance there, in the background, was a series of picture galleries in which the Turner paintings were installed. Here's a view from the exterior. And here, the interior of these spaces in South Kensington. Now, in the 1860s, the bulk of the paintings, the finished paintings, were returned to the National Gallery on Trafalgar Square when they had enlarged the gallery and had room to accommodate them again. And these displays were the way that visitors to London from the 1860s on would have appreciated Turner in the 19th century. Here we have a view of one of the galleries with the Hannibal crossing the Alps, a painting in our exhibition, hanging at the left in the background. And here, another sentimental painting of one of the warders, one of the guards at the museum, telling the story of the Battle of Trafalgar and pointing to the great picture. Again, a painting in our exhibition in which Turner recounts the story of what happened at Trafalgar. So in this large gallery filled with giant pictures by Turner, we see people of all social classes coming to marvel at the works of art. By 1887, when Queen Victoria reached her Diamond Jubilee, a print like this could be made in which she sits by the fire and thinks about the great men of Great Britain. Alas, no woman is among them, but the great men of politics, of literature, of music, and of art. And at the very top of this pantheon is Turner and the young John Everett Millais, not so young in 1887, but young in comparison to Turner. There they are, the artist from, in a sense, the beginning of her career, an artist who was in his prime when she came to the throne and who had, in fact, followed her career up until his death in 1851. But back to the National Gallery. This shows a room at the gallery somewhat later, I would guess in the 1880s. And we see many of the paintings that we know from the exhibition or from other photographs. They're a little bit hard to decipher here, but once you know Turner, you can tell them apart. But what's more important is that in the later years, it was possible for artists and visitors to see all of the sketches. These were returned to the gallery only in the 1870s. In the early 1870s, they would have been visible only at South Kensington. That's where, of course, all of the British artists who came to see them, or all of the French artists who came across the Channel at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, saw Turner's sketchy works, while they could see the more finished paintings at the National Gallery. But these galleries opened at the end of the 1870s, And artists of all stripes and visitors of all stripes could go and study the watercolors and the oil sketches that were certainly the preponderance of the works of art in the Turner bequest. They could see works like these from the exhibition, The Industrial Town, that we saw earlier, a great Venetian watercolor, The Moon Rising Above the Lagoon, a Nocturne from Venice, or this remarkably minimal view, probably inspired by Venice, but a watercolor just of the horizon of the sea at sunset. And they could see paintings like this one, this unfinished picture of the Thames above Waterloo. And it's works like this one that inspired artists like James McNeill Whistler and Claude Monet, both of whom came to see works by Turner in the 1860s in Whistler's case, and in 1871, 71 in Monet's case. They could see works like this one, the keelmen holding the colliers putting coal into the hull of a ship, and be inspired to paint the sort of day-to-day life of the riverside. Here's Whistler's Wapping from the 1860s, one of his great etchings from the late 1850s, and Monet's Pool of London, the Thames at London, with, you can see one of the bridges in the background, and teeming with activity here in the center of London. And this is something that would influence him for quite some time when he came to paint quasi-industrial settings, like these men carrying coal up and down planks to and from barges at Argenteuil. Or when he came to paint steam and smokestacks erupting in the rail yards at the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, with the Pont de l'Europe rising above his head. They could also be inspired by Turner's own practice and by the facture, the surface quality of Turner's paintings. Take, for example, this amazing picture of a disaster at sea, which probably is inspired by the wreck of a ship called the Amphitrite, which foundered off the coast of France in the 1820s. This amazing painting might well be inspirational when Whistler turned to paint a picture like The Falling Rocket, the sort of chaotic center of the painting, and above all, the inflection of tiny strokes in the case of Whistler, somewhat larger strokes of paint in the case of Turner. Turner's at the left, Whistler at the right, activating the surface with seemingly abstract forms, which we read as fireworks, a falling rocket in Whistler's painting, and perhaps as the falling embers from a flare in Turner's painting. So looking very closely at the works of art themselves, they could be inspired by the way Turner had painted, by the freedom with which Turner left some of his canvases unfinished, their beautiful surfaces with their sort of gorgeous, very sympathetic brushwork, the activity on the surface of the canvas, and the sort of textural qualities that were present in the paint. And then in some of his most remarkable paintings, the virtual absence of anything. Here's a painting of the lagoon in Venice, of Santa Maria della Salute, and we see that there is hardly anything there. This is certainly an unfinished painting, almost certainly just the first layer of what would have been a much more complicated picture. But it was there in 1870 for Monet to see, and there throughout the 1870s and 80s for Whistler to see, as he painted his beautiful virtually monochromatic pictures of the Thames with factories in the distance or not. And it was certainly the kind of picture that inspired Monet to come in 1899 and again over the course of the next few years up until 1903 to come to London and to put himself in a room in the Savoy Hotel just above Waterloo Bridge, where Turner had painted his Image of Pollution a generation or two before. And to paint that bridge under changing conditions of light and atmosphere, London being a place where you could count on the atmosphere, the envelope that Monet would talk about, the surrounding atmosphere in between his eye and the motif, where you could count on that envelope being active because of all of the steam, the smoke, the weather that was produced, in fact, the microclimate of London, which caused amazing fogs to settle over the city. You could count on London having these highly charged climatic effects on a day-to-day basis. And this is why Monet came to paint there, because the city had more, in a way, of atmosphere to paint than Paris did. So setting himself up over the Thames, he paints these pictures which are like hymns to Turner's paintings, to the kinds of paintings that he's seeing in the Turner bequest. The Turner he's beginning to understand over the course of looking at works by him in the London museums. And over the course of time, he paints pictures which, like Turner's, grow more and more abstract until we have a painting like the Waterloo Bridge by Monet at the right, which has no more detail than the painting of the Cathédrale de la Salute by Turner at the left. There's a kind of cliche that says that Turner is the origin of abstract painting. And I think that's a cliche that's a bit overstressed, because I don't think it's likely that Jackson Pollock turned to Turner or was thinking about Turner when he painted an image like the one at the right 100 years later. But what's interesting is that Turner, I believe, had made it possible to value a picture in which there was hardly any subject at all. And the admiration that people had worked up for Turner's late works and for the free and modern painting style, which we equate with Turner's late years because of their lack of finish. This made it possible to admire what artists and critics came to call all-over painting in which the entire surface is covered in an equal way by paint, as Turner's had been in his sketchiest images from the 1840s. Whether in Pollock or in Janet Sobel or in Sam Gilliam in the post-war generations. Now, would Turner, young or old, recognize himself at all in these works of art? The answer to that question is almost certainly no. But Turner's works can have a meaning after his death that they didn't have before it. Turner, in the modern world, has taken on new meanings and new significance that transcend what Turner had done, for all that paintings like this are works of Turner's late years and works that he, in effect, had abandoned. They are also works of genius, works that we admire and very much cherish in our modern world. I thank you for listening to me, and I hope you will have seen Turner's Modern World at the Kimball Art Museum. Thank you.